Episode 39, Polar Explorer, Adventurist, and Extreme Athlete, Ben Saunders. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Ben Saunders. Ben is one of the world's leading polar explorers and a record-breaking long-distance skier who has covered more than 4,300 miles on foot in the polar region. His accomplishments include skiing solo to both the North and South Poles and leading the Sky Decks Petition, the longest human-powered polar journey in history, a 105-day, 1,800-mile round trip from the coast of Antarctica to the South Pole and back again. Ben, my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the show.
It's great to speak to you, Glenn. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, I said explore in the intro. I'm curious if that's how you define yourself. I wasn't sure if I should call you an explorer, an endurance athlete, an adventurist, or something else altogether. So what exactly are you?
I've never been quite sure how to describe what I do for a living, and I'm envious of friends of mine who are mountaineers or ultra runners or sailors, yacht racers. They've got pretty, even though they do extreme stuff, they've got pretty standard sounding job descriptions. But yeah, polar explorer sounds a bit grand, to me. It's a bit like being in the army and maybe introducing yourself as a warrior. So I don't know. Long distance skier. I see myself definitely as an athlete rather than an explorer in the Edwardian sense of the word. I'm definitely not skiing along during maps. That's all been done, really.
As this, whether we call it exploration, adventure, were these seeds planted early in your life? Like, was this something you aspired to as a child?
I think it was deep down. I was lucky. I got a younger brother, so we were pretty close as kids, and we grew up in the southwest of the UK, a county called Devon, so quite rural. And I've lived in London for 20 years now, so I realised that most young people don't have the opportunity to be outside, in the great outdoors in the way that I had as a kid. So we were outdoors a lot as kids. I was in the Boy Scouts. I'm not quite sure where the screw came loose completely, but I always loved being outside, and that's never really changed.
If we can maybe cover a somewhat dark chapter, because I like to understand the events in someone's childhood that might have shaped them. And I believe your parents divorced when you were pretty young, and your father, as I understand it, abandoned you. So can you maybe discuss that chapter in your life?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's fascinating that this seems to be a kind of recurring theme that people in almost everyone I've come across that has sort of excelled in any discipline. There seems to be something driving them, some kind of hunger, some sort of trauma from some past experience. And yeah, in my case, my parents split up when I was pretty young. That's not unusual nowadays. But my dad basically vanished a few years later, and he was an orphan. So there was never any family on his side. There were no grandparents, no one else at all. So just him. And he disappeared when I was about 10 years old. And I found him again 26 years later, age 36, 37. But there was a big gap. My mum remarried, but I was never very close to my stepfather. They divorced again after about 10 years. So for most of my childhood, most of my early adulthood, there was a kind of big gap. There was a big blank space where I was looking for a male role model. I was looking for a kind of template, an example of what it meant to be a man. What was I aspiring to become as a human being? So it's probably pretty obvious now that the sort of role models and heroes that I latched onto as a kid were explorers. They were pioneers. They were characters from history. Captain Scott, Sir Ernest Shackleton, Fridtjof Nansen, Roald Amundsen. These incredible Edwardian era pioneers. They were mountaineers. There were some extraordinary British characters, people like Chris Bonington, people like Edmund Hillary, first climb Everest. They were, round the world sailors. They were people like a guy called John Ridgway, who was the first person to row across the Atlantic.
But why were those the people? You could have latched on to entrepreneurs. You could have latched on to researchers. Why explorers?
I loved, even as a kid, I loved being outside, loved adventure, and loved testing myself, challenging myself, trying to explore my own limits, really, with the outdoors as a backdrop.
So let's get on to the Sky Decks Petition.
Mm.
This is what you chose to replicate. The Scott stands for Captain Robert Falcon Scott, the famous early 20th century explorer. So let me set the stage for those who aren't familiar with it. This expedition is in Antarctica, the coldest, windiest, driest, highest altitude continent on Earth. It was, again, a 105-day, 1,800-mile round trip from the coast to the South Pole and back. Temperatures could dip down to the negative 70s. There were complete whiteout conditions at times, and crevasses hundreds of feet deep. And as for Captain Scott, well, he and his crew all perished on that journey. But somehow, none of that dissuaded you, Ben. So the obvious question is why? Why did you attempt this over a century later?
Yeah, it seems to me like just a fascinating challenge and a fascinating kind of puzzle. Like, how come this journey hadn't been finished yet, and how come every Antarctic expedition since then, in more than 100 years, had been somehow shorter or easier than the journey made by these guys? The last three of Scott's team that died in 1912, including Captain Scott, they covered nearly 1,600 miles on foot in the harshest conditions on the planet. So to me, it seemed extraordinary that they set the bar so high, a century ago. It was as if the marathon record or the Ironman triathlon record had been set in 1912 and no one had been able to break it. So it seemed incredible that this journey still hadn't been finished. It was pretty iconic. Most people, certainly in the UK, Scott and Shackleton are still household names. They're still icons of polar exploration. And it seemed incredible to me that given 100 years worth of innovation and advance and technology, things like clothing and equipment and the navigation, GPS, satellite phones, how come no one had finished this journey? How come no one had genuinely raised the bar in that field? So that was the kind of question that I sought to answer, and it became a bit of an obsession, like finishing this giant unfinished journey in Antarctica.
Right, but Ben, it's not like not finishing a marathon where you hail an Uber and get yourself home. I mean, it's not finishing as in you die. When you go into something like this, do you accept death as a possible outcome?
Gosh, I mean, you're right. The precedent for this journey did not look great. My mom's never been that happy about the way my career path has panned out. But the precedent for this journey looks pretty extreme. 9 people, Scott's team, Shackleton's team, had attempted this journey in history. None of them had made it, and 5 of them had died in the process. So the odds kind of didn't look great. Now, in some ways, nowadays there is a safety net that did not exist for Scott or Shackleton. Theoretically, we were never out of range of being picked up if things went wrong, if we were ill or injured or there was some catastrophic equipment failure. But having said that, Antarctica is a huge place. It's the size of the United States and Mexico put together, so it's an enormous continent. And if you need picking up, it's a little twin-prop ski plane that is flying out to pick you up from the opposite side of the continent. So the scale of this place is immense. The distance aircraft would have to fly in an emergency are immense. And if the weather's bad, it could take a few days. So I tried not to dwell on that too much. And it's obviously a place that's not without risk, but to me the risk was justifiable. And I sort of came at this as a professional. This was my 11th expedition. I had a decent amount of experience under my belt. So to me, the level of risk was justifiable.
Well, you went with one other person, each of you carrying your own sleds, each weighing 440 pounds at the start. And you still managed, if I did my calculation right, to cover 17 miles a day in these treacherous conditions.
Yeah.
So how do you train for that kind of endeavor?
Yeah. So we were, on the one hand, it was an ultra endurance challenge. We're trying to cover 1,800 miles on foot, in some incredibly challenging conditions. But on the other hand, it's like a strongman event. You're wearing a harness, dragging this sled that at the start was 440 pounds each. So that's like two pretty big guys in a bathtub, dragging them through sand. So, I mean, you talked about the average distance being about 17 miles, but daily distance. But the challenge was that early on, the sledges are heaviest. The sledge gets lighter every day. You're eating food, burning fuel in the stove to melt snow to get water. So the sled gets marginally easier every day.
But in terms of the training aspect, I mean, I assume you're not carrying two guys in a bathtub around a desert. Is this like, are you training hours and hours a day? Is this, hitting the weight room? Is it doing long distance running? Is it like, what's the actual regimen to get to the point where you can be doing this?
I've been an athlete for years. So in some ways, this has been a kind of progression with each expedition, being a stepping stone, kind of bringing us closer to this big project. But I guess there was also about 18 months of quite specific training and preparation. And up to, at kind of peak periods, maybe 25, 30 hours a week of training. So we were training like full-time athletes. And yet we were also trying to manage this really complex project at the same time. So I often said it felt a bit like training for the Olympics and trying to kind of project manage the build of the stadium at the same time. So there was a lot to juggle. And the training, and I live in London, so there are no glaciers nearby. So I'd have to improvise. So most of my training when I was at home was the bulk of it was endurance training. So high volume, cycling, running, hiking with a pack with some weight in it using poles. And then normally 3 gym sessions a week in the weight room, and that was heavy strength training. So big, what are called compound lifts, like squats, deadlifts, with a lot of weight. So, and I quite enjoyed the challenge of juggling these competing kind of disciplines in as far as the physical training went. And the conventional thinking is that they're entirely contradictory, that you can't be like a power lifter and a marathon runner, to any decent standard. And yet we managed to kind of prove a lot of people wrong. So in the 2-3 years building up to that project in 2013, I ran a 2:55 marathon. So I pre-qualified for most marathons as an elite runner. And so I did 220 kilo deadlift. So I'm just trying to work out what was in pounds, but 485 pound deadlift. So for my body weight, that was a competitive standard as a power lifter. So it was quite rewarding, like getting really good at both strength and endurance. But it took a lot of time. There was not much social life.
So how about the mental training? I mean, how do you prepare for all this torture you're going to endure?
In so many ways, these expeditions are way more challenging mentally than they are physically. There's only so much training you can do beforehand. And once you're out there, you can never really recover fully from one day to the next. So with each day, you're becoming more fatigued. Often there are little injuries and things start cropping up. And very quickly it becomes a question of mentally how badly you want this goal. And it's a hard thing to prepare for, especially from the comfort of your home, in the civilized Western world. It's such an alien environment. And in some ways, I think over the years, there's been a sort of cumulative, I built up expertise and experience with each expedition that I've done. With every journey, I've always come back with lessons learned and things that I can do better the next time. I think there was a deliberate, for me and for my teammate Tarka, we deliberately sought out a number of events and challenges, before we went to Antarctica that we could do together, that gave us kind of mental reference points that we could fall back on when things were tough. And they weren't necessarily directly applicable to the fitness we'd be using. We did, for example, a race in Chamonix in the French Alps called a vertical kilometer, which is a running race straight up the side of a mountain, beneath a chairlift. And it's 1,000 vertical meters of ascent, straight up the side of the mountain. And physically, really, really tough thing to do. It only took us like an hour, but a really tough challenge. And we both did that together, the summer before we went to Antarctica. We went to Greenland. We did a training expedition in Greenland for 3 weeks, using the same gear, the same clothing, the same food, almost as a sort of dress rehearsal. So there were a number of really deliberate building blocks and stepping stones, taking us closer to this huge goal.
So when you're moving, 10, 12 hours a day, these frigid temperatures, near isolation, and with scenery that I'm assuming stays pretty much the same, right? And I'm guessing if you could look back at the end of a day when you're pretty much near exhaustion, you look back and you can probably see where you started. How do you stay motivated? How do you escape the monotony of it all? Are you thinking about the ultimate goal and that keeps you going? Is it like a day at a time or even maybe a step at a time?
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, most of Antarctica is pretty flat, pretty white, pretty featureless. We spent the first leg of our journey took 28 days. We were crossing an area called the Ross Ice Shelf, which is the same size as California. So we basically started our journey by walking diagonally across California and then turning right, once we got some mountains. So we walked in a straight line for 28 days and we saw nothing. We finished each day at a point that looked exactly the same as where we started from that morning. So there's not much going on. You are disconnected, offline. There are no other people, nothing man-made. So it's a pretty alien environment. And I think the way I got through it was kind of breaking it down into manageable chunks. And there were many days, especially early on, where we're still making slow progress, where we're still struggling to cover 6, 7, 8 miles in a full day. And at those moments, the idea of covering 1,800 miles was demotivating. It just seemed so far-fetched that we might as well quit. I have these different mental kind of strategies I'd use, and I guess in a nutshell, it revolved around kind of shortening the focus to a point where it felt manageable and achievable. And sometimes that was as far as the end of the day. Sometimes it was as far as the next hour, and almost giving myself permission to quit. But I'd say, well, we're not going to quit right now. We can quit, when we stop to eat and drink in an hour's time. We'd stop every 90 minutes, every hour and a half and that's the only time we got to talk. We'd sort of pull the sledges together, sit on the sledge, pull out some, flask of drink and hot drink and some, energy bars and snacks. And we talk for a few minutes and then we carry on. I kind of secretly, I never really said this explicitly to my teammate, but I internally would give myself permission to quit. I'd say, look, this is so tough. This is impossible, but I'm not going to quit right now. I'm not going to sit on my sledge and give up. I'm going to do another hour. Or sometimes I'd use a geographical feature. I'd say, well, that bit of ice on the horizon, that looks good. We can camp there. You could land an aircraft there. That'd be a good place to quit. So I'm going to forget the rest of it. I'm just going to focus everything on getting to that bit of ice. And then I'll think about the rest of it. And invariably you'd get there. And I think, well, that wasn't, I haven't collapsed yet. Maybe we shouldn't quit here. Maybe we can get to that next bit of ice on the horizon. That looks like a better campsite. And that's how I got through it. When things were tough. It wasn't always hellishly tough. There were moments of absolute magic and beauty and joy as well. So there were huge, huge highs and lows.
On the return journey, 46 miles shy of one of your deposits of food, hypoglycemic, completely out of food, you made the decision, perhaps an agonizing decision, to call for help for a plane to deliver some food and fuel. What happened?
Yeah, my dream had always been to make this journey with no outside support. If you look at the Edwardian pioneers, whether it was Scott or Shackleton or Amundsen, they all had big support teams that were pre-positioning their kind of depots of food and fuel and supplies. So almost like the kind of booster rockets, peeling away from a spacecraft, and then finally you had this small team at the end that would sort of finish the journey and then travel back to the coast. We didn't have that. We were pulling everything ourselves, from day one. But in much the same way, we would bury these caches, these depots of food stretching out towards the pole. We left 10 depots in total. We left the last one quite a long way from the pole, thinking there would be a lot of factors in our favor. It would be midsummer. We should have the best conditions. The sledges would be almost empty. We should theoretically be traveling really quickly. Now, it didn't pan out that way. We had some very bad weather. Physically, we were completely, exhausted. And we were traveling more slowly than we'd anticipated. And as you said, we essentially ran out of food 43 miles short of our first depot. And that was looking back, the kind of crux of the entire expedition. And for me, it was a crux as the leader of this project and someone who ultimately was responsible for not only my own survival, but that of my teammate as well, who'd agreed to come along with me. This was always my plan ultimately. So I had to make a decision. We could either head off into very poor weather, physically, at a dangerously low ebb. We both had hypothermia, we both had hypoglycemia, we both had minor frost injury. We were not well. We could head off with zero safety margin, and that just felt reckless. We could quit. Or perhaps there might be this third option, which was to call, and we hadn't really planned this in advance, but perhaps we could ask the aircraft that would pick us up in an emergency to bring us some more food. So that's what we did. And it felt, that I remember that day calling for help. It felt like failure, felt like compromise. My dream had been to make this journey completely unassisted, unsupported, and here we were asking for help. Now, 5 years on nearly, looking back, that was actually one of the proudest moments of my entire life. And I think it was perhaps when I matured as a leader, I guess, and learned to, it was a big lesson in getting priorities right. And it was a big lesson also. I think up until that point, I'd been driven by perfectionism. And this was so close to being the ultimate expedition. In almost every sense. This was the highest I'd ever dared to aim. And we were so close, 43 miles away, which in 1,800 miles is a fraction, a hair's breadth away from the ultimate expression of everything I was passionate about. And here we were having to ask for help. So it brought me face to face with a lot of things. And it was a very challenging decision, very challenging call to make. But actually now looking back, one of my proudest moments.
Well, the assist aside, you did finish the journey. So here you are, you finally reached this all-consuming goal of yours. You set this new record. How did it change you? Like, are you a different person today because of it?
I think, like, in the kind of grand scheme of things, profoundly different. There was this extraordinary anticlimax at the end of that journey. There was a very definite finish line, getting back to the coast of a place called Ross Island, which is on the kind of New Zealand side of Antarctica. That's where Scott and Shackleton started from. Is where Scott would have finished had he survived. So there's a definite finish line, and I realized that I'd been aiming for that finish line for a decade, like not just 105 days of very hard physical and mental slog in Antarctica, but actually years and years of sacrifice and training and time and energy and effort, all aiming for this finish line. So when we finally got there and I stepped across it, nothing happened. It was kind of strangely devoid of emotion. There were no sort of fireworks, physically or metaphorically. It was just a strange feeling of kind of relief. I mean, of course, we were happy that we'd done it. We got there. But it wasn't the kind of elation that I was expecting. It was a peculiar moment. I think in hindsight, I kind of made the mistake of living in the future, kind of thinking, things aren't great now, but when I get there, they're going to be awesome. Thinking that success was a threshold, was a finish line. That if I worked hard enough or achieved enough or accumulated enough of something, then one day I would get there, I'd cross that line and my life would change, beyond all recognition.
When you say your life would change, in what ways did you think your life might change?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I think what I was expecting was this instant, like a switch, like feeling of, I don't know, like contentment and happiness and I'm trying to think what else I was sort of yearning for back then, but completion, who knows? And actually, it's been a slow burn. Ironically now, I feel more content than I've ever felt in my entire life. And I just think it took a lot of time. Like, it took a few years for the lessons from that journey and that experience to kind of sink in, really. And they were around. A lot of people talk. There's a lot of stuff nowadays about being present and being mindful, and a lot of that kind of descends into cliche almost. But there's something in that. There's something in the idea that the journey is the important part and not the destination.
Do you subscribe to that?
Very, very much so. Very much so. And ironically, looking back, for me, the most rewarding parts of these journeys have not been finishing them. It's been the journey themselves, and often looking back, the happiest moments were when I or we as a small team were really up against it. We were trying to figure out some grand challenge, and often with a lot of people around us doubting us, a lot of self-doubt, and trying to overcome some big challenge. So that, ironically, looking back, that's where I was happiest. It wasn't completing these things; it was working on these things.
The Sky Decks Petition was a few years back. Last year, you attempted to make the first unassisted solo crossing of Antarctica. Your friend Henry Worsley died attempting that same journey. Why was the solo trip so important to you?
Yeah, I think my motivation last year came from a very different place. It felt, this friend of mine, Henry, had died attempting the same thing. He fell ill in Antarctica. He had a ruptured stomach ulcer, so he was physically very ill. It wasn't just that he died of exhaustion. There were other factors, and it hit me really hard. My immediate reaction when I heard that news was I didn't ever want to go back to these places. Like, it seems the risks and the potential costs just seemed way too high. So it took a long time, many months, for my mindset to shift to the point where I realized that I was one of a handful of people that had the experience, the ability to take on the challenge that he'd taken on, making this first ever solo crossing of Antarctica, unsupported, unassisted. And he was, Henry was a friend of mine. He was also a real role model. He was I'm 41. He was mid-50s. He was a decorated military leader. He'd been in the Special Forces most of his life, the British Army. He was a husband, a father. He was an author. He was a philanthropist. He was an artist. So he was this incredible kind of Renaissance man, and someone I looked up to enormously. He was always very generous with his time and his wisdom, and just the most incredible character to be around. So he inspired me greatly, and so it felt eventually that there might be an opportunity for me to honor Henry and the friendship and the inspiration that he'd given me by attempting the same journey, and also by supporting the charity he was supporting, and kind of trying to finish the job for him, really. So that was the motivation behind that last expedition.
Well, you seem to like to explore human limits, push the boundaries of what the body and what the mind are capable of accomplishing. Why this fascination with pushing yourself to extremes?
It's a good question. I think looking back, ironically, one of the biggest lessons for me last year in Antarctica, in my most recent expedition, was in a way that being back down there in Antarctica, back in my sledge harness, in my 12th big expedition, that actually that was one of the least adventurous things I could be doing. I've spent nearly 2 decades leading these expeditions. I've kind of figured it out, really. And for me, the most rewarding parts, the most growth came from, trying to figure out some enormous challenge. And I kind of feel I went down there with a very different attitude to risk. I was engaged in Antarctica last year. I got married this summer, so there was more responsibility. And I think I had less to prove. I felt, I'd already broken this enormous record back in early 2014. My teammate Tark and I, we still hold the record for the longest ever polar journey on foot. So that's going to take a lot of beating. Both in terms of competition, but for me also internally. Like I feel that I've taken that game as far as I want to take it. So I can't share too much right now, but there's a big challenge that I'm working on, which is more of an entrepreneurial challenge. It's to do with a business. It involves the polar regions, but it's a whole different scale of complexity and funding. It means dealing with investors and lawyers and all sorts of new stuff. So in a way, I find myself almost back to square one, with a chance to apply the lessons that I've learned, but actually being adventurous again and trying to figure out a new challenge in a different field.
When you try to prove something with these journeys, are you trying to prove something to yourself or to someone else?
I think early on, my first, I was 23 on my first big North Pole expedition in 2001. And I think there was a lot of ego tied up in that back then. I had, and I think as a kid, I had pretty low self-esteem, so there was a lot of like wanting to prove myself and test myself and kind of show people what I was capable of achieving. So in the early days of my career, a lot of it was about seeking some external validation, trying to kind of make a name for myself in a challenging field. So I think early on, a lot of it was external, and that's definitely shifted over the years. And I kind of navigate nowadays far more on an internal compass. I've got very little desire for fame or celebrity or any kind of external approval. Like I think that's come from the achievements that I've managed to enjoy in the field that I'm passionate about. So my motivation has shifted over the years, but for sure, it's always been a competition of a combination of the two. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't still competitive. I didn't enjoy entering running races or bike races or those kinds of things. But it's shifted over the years.
You mentioned earlier about being content. I feel like our society has been wrestling with this amorphous concept of contentment, of happiness, for some time. Like there's been some sort of conscious reawakening as to what matters in life. So what did this journey, these multiple journeys, I guess, what did it teach you about happiness?
Wow. I think these journeys have taught me, I'm not religious, but I there's a lot in Buddhism that I think makes the most sense to me, and there's a lot in that about, and I forget the Buddhist term for it, but it's about this sort of yearning for completion and a sort of feeling of wholeness that is like the root of all human unhappiness. And I think there's something in that. For so many years, I was like striving, battling away, working really hard to one day sort of reach some physical or metaphorical finish line where I thought I might finally have that feeling of having achieved everything I wanted to achieve. And of course, life doesn't work that way. And I think happiness for me has come from this realization that life is always, you're always going to have an unfinished list. There are always going to be things that you want to do or wish you'd done or could have done and didn't do. And it's always going to be a kind of messy, collection of like unfinished loops and incomplete lists of dreams. And I'm kind of cool with that nowadays. And it's taken me a while to get to that point, to realize that no one has all the answers. Everyone still kind of ultimately is trying to figure it out. Everyone's making it up as they go along, and that's just the way it is. So I think that's been the biggest realization for me, and a lot of it comes down to just being a bit more present and a bit more mindful. And yes, I'm still motivated by ambition and goals and wanting to get to the next place, but that isn't everything for me anymore. I think a big part of me is getting better at kind of looking around and realizing how lucky I am to be where I am.
You do a lot of public speaking. What's your message? What lessons would you like people to learn?
Yeah, I think my hope is that my story is one about human potential. I was never some naturally talented athlete. I was never like a high school sports star. I kind of struggled a lot. I struggled academically. I never excelled at anything. I was never like seemingly destined for greatness in any field at all. I think my parents were pretty worried about me as a kid, drifting along with no real direction. And I've gone on to achieve some extraordinary things in a field that I'm still passionate about. So I think the biggest ingredient in the success I've enjoyed has been belief has been this sort of combination of courage and confidence. And the biggest lesson personally has been that self-belief is a malleable human quality. It's a bit like physical strength or endurance. It's a human quality that responds to stimulus. And in my experience, the more time you spend outside your comfort zone, living adventurously, taking on challenges, the stronger it becomes. And the reverse is true. Like if you only do what you know how to do, if you only do what you've always done, if you only do what's comfortable, then your self-belief never really grows. It's like a muscle that's not used. It kind of atrophies and withers and becomes weaker. So that's the biggest lesson for me, that you have to, in order to kind of expand your limits, you have to spend time, as an athlete, to succeed as an athlete, it means being uncomfortable a lot of the time in training and in competition. And I think it's the same in life. Like to genuinely expand your limits, it means spending time outside your comfort zone. And that is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to involve self-doubt and fear and uncertainty. And they're all very, very normal human emotions and experiences.
The name of this podcast is The Art of Excellence. What's your definition of excellence?
Oh, wow. I think my definition of excellence, when I think of like excellent people, a lot of it is to do with their drive and their hunger for knowledge and experience and kind of curiosity. So to me, the people that I look up to want to have an impact on the world. They want to try and improve the world, to try to make things better, to try to have a positive influence on people around them. So to me, that is excellence. This kind of internal drive to somehow make tomorrow better than today. I think that's the closest I can come to a definition.
Well, I love it. I love that definition. Ben, one of my favorite all-time books is Endurance, the story that chronicles Sir Ernest Shackleton's journey to the South Pole. And in some ways, I feel like I'm talking to the reincarnated Shackleton here. I love this story. I love what you've done. I really appreciate the self-reflection and certainly the modesty as well. It's pretty miraculous what you've been able to accomplish, and I admire it and really enjoyed hearing your story. I can't thank you enough for sharing it with my audience.
Glenn, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for sticking with it through our communication challenges. I wonder if phoning in from my satellite phone from my tent in Antarctica would have been a clearer signal. So it was a real joy, and I hope my hope really is that some of my story might be food for thought for your listeners, and just might get people thinking differently about their own potential and their own aspirations.
Thanks, Ben.
Real pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.